Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to this final meeting of the Ian Ramsay Centre this academic year. And we have a very full crowd tonight, which is very good news and also entirely understandable. We have a very good speaker and a very able panel as well. And this evening's lecture takes a slightly different format. Professor Tom McLeish, who I'll introduce in a moment, will give a talk arising from his recent book, which is very interesting indeed. And then we will have a group of panelists who will begin to respond. We'll invite Professor McLeish to make a brief response to the responses, and then we'll bring you into the conversation. So let me begin, if I may, by introducing our main speaker, which is Professor Tom McLeish of the University of Durham, where he serves as Professor of Physics and also as the Pro-Vice Chancellor. He has a very distinguished research record, and for our purposes tonight, what's really important is the book, Faith and Wisdom in Science. And Tom will be talking about this, but the book is interesting in many ways, not simply because it brings some very, very interesting insights to the whole issue of the relation of science and religion, but actually because it also brings a whole range of insight into the nature of science itself. So it is actually, I think, a very interesting book. And I'm going to begin by simply asking you to welcome Professor Tom McLeish to talk to us about this book, Faith and Wisdom in Science.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Alistair, very, very much. Thank you, co-panelists. I'm very, very happy to be here. It's always lovely to come back to this place. Actually, it's not the first time I've spoken at the Ian Ramsay Centre. Andrew has been a wonderful host before. The last time I spoke was actually trialling some of the ideas around the Book of Job for this book in a very clunky and overextended way. And you'll be glad to know that this is just a very short. Well, I've got about 10 minutes of very summary ideas. I thought I'd talk about the book, and then we'll go into the much more interesting bit from the panel and from you. I should say that we were expecting Oxford University Press to be here. Don't think they've turned up yet, but hope springs, actually faith springs eternal, hope springs eternal. And as one of our panelists pointed out, actually from Hebrews, faith is indeed belief in that which is not seen. So we're still hoping that our friends at OUP may turn up. But if they don't, then in place of books, there are some flyers you can take if you, after what I've said, are still interested by some miracle in buying a copy of this book for yourself. You can get it for 30% off. Writing a book does turn one, by the way, into the most appalling self-publicist. I've just discovered I've discovered many things writing this book, and one of them is those. So greetings, Oxford friends, from another ancient place of learning, and I can't help but remind us of the beauty of the place that I'm currently working in, inspirational as it is to, as I'm sure, and I know you do, to be working in a place that has known scholarship for centuries and centuries and centuries. It almost comes out of the rock. You'll also know that a number of Oxford houses were founded from Durham, including one not so very far from where we stand. So coals to Newcastle, really. I haven't got time to talk about the book, so I'd better just talk about my prejudices. So here they are. I mean, no one writes a balanced book. They write a book because their heart, as much as their head, tells them to. So here it is. And you should understand, I'm writing this book as a scientist, but also as a consummate trespasser. My current second job as Pro-Vice Chancellor is for research. It's not the Pro-Vice Chancellor, there are actually far too many of us, about 7 of them. But I look after the university's research portfolio. This allows me, to wander into the English department on Monday and the chemistry department on Tuesday and actually claim I'm paid to do all this stuff and learn from people from many walks of life and many disciplines. And that is, in a very large way, has unlocked for me many of the things I wanted to talk about for this book. But I am at core a scientist, and it pains me. This book has been written partly from an experience of pain in many ways. Those who are scientists do feel, many of us, pain at the cultural alienation of this human activity that we love, that is still somehow dressed up by the Today programme as a court jester, still somewhat alienated from cultural life, doesn't have the same embrace as music, art, dance, saga, and some of us have always felt that it should. Science desperately needs a deep cultural narrative. I also have the prejudice that let me put it this way, the activity we now call science is the name of the chapter of a book we are currently reading that has had many, many previous chapters in a collinear narrative, some of which are maybe called by other names. Natural philosophy is one of my favourite ones. Ancient wisdom might be another. And that the perception that science is just modern is harmful. For one thing, it's harmful. It doesn't allow us any resources to draw on to discover a long human cultural narrative in support of this activity called science. And that has other consequences. I think it impoverishes our personal and communal well-being. It paralyses the public debate. What I mean by this is I'm interested that we can't seem to have an adult political conversation around genetic modified organisms, fracking, climate change, debates that are essential to civilization, to human life, to negotiating global community, get stuck, get entrenched in prejudice. Scientific evidence becomes a political football. It becomes relativized. And I was interested in the reasons for this. And thirdly, but by no means least importantly, it distorts this whole relation of science and religion. So in a way, this book is more about telling a cultural story of science, but it becomes a book about science and religion. But as I say to some of my friends, it is about science and religion, but not as we know it, Jim. In this case, it really is not as we know it, Jim. So there's the prejudices. Here's the manifesto. I strongly suspect that in many ways, the self-advertised science-religion debate is just the wrong place to look for the science and religion debate. That actually some of the consequences we saw on the last slide are more interesting places to tease out thoughts, avenues, questions that might get us unstuck. From the point of view of the Bible, so here's another prejudice of the manifesto. I've always felt that Genesis is a very bad place to start. Kind of unfortunate it turns out to be chapter 1 of the canonical library, right? There's nothing wrong with Genesis. One, of course, far from it. It's the most extraordinary, deep, wonderful architecture sort of text, but it's formal, it's liturgical, it's very developed. If one's looking for biblical creation stories, it's not Creation 101. There are other places to look. The Psalms are replete with creation stories. The wisdom literature finds them glittering in all sorts of deep and simple places. The New Testament also has creation stories. So if one's interested in diffusing the creationism debate, and I certainly am, then one initial way of doing that is to bring together the panoply of biblical creation material before one even starts. And for many years I've wanted to write about, as a scientist, the ultimate, the peak of the wisdom literature, so I'm concerned, which is the Book of Job, the extraordinary, deep, paradoxical, poetical, wonderful Book of Job, principally the Lord's answer. And that, I think, is the right place to start, rather than Genesis. Much of the science debate draws on quantum mechanics and cosmology, and so whiz-bang, begging Catherine's pardon, we'll hear about cosmology, it's a wonderful science, but hardly at all the science of complexity, the science of statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, the complexity of the material world. And I felt, as a science that happens to be my area of science, but hey, I said there were prejudices, right? But there's also untapped wells of interest in science, as Alistair already pointed out. And then conjunctions. See, for about 5 years, I thought the problem with the theology and science debate was the theology. It just wasn't adequate, wasn't up to the task, wasn't getting there. And then I realised actually the theologians had done a very good job, and actually it was almost certainly the science. The science was the problem. We were entrenched in our ways. We'd developed a particular mindset that didn't talk with other subjects and disciplines. And then I realised the problem was with the and, after all. A little word in the middle that refuses to call attention to itself, but sets the geometry of the entire debate. Because as soon as we talk about Jack and Jill, black and white, Catholic and Protestant, it's the and that does all the work. But it does it in a quiet and mischievous way that doesn't draw attention to the fact it has geometrized and opposed the debate, created a tennis court with a net before we've even started. So as soon as you invite our colleague here, Professor Richard Dawkins, and an archbishop, to debate the theology and science debate, we know there's going to be a sort of Wimbledon of ideas. And that the issue there is that those words aren't even self-consistent. You see, there is nothing that theology will not speak about. Definitions of theology are rife. I think the definition that leads us towards a study of God is an almost heretical one. I think we do that, but certainly studying everything in the light of God is a definition of theology that's always warmed to me. Everything, including science, by the way. Similarly, science really knows no bounds. There is nothing under the sun that science will not legitimately consider and study. So these two approaches, these two cultural activities, these two narratives need to be of each other, not, if you'll excuse the gross grammar, and each other. They are of each other. What does that mean? It means I should stop very soon, actually. So what I'm saying is that this means a reappraisal of science, culturally, anthropologically, theologically, and, by the way, there's one more little observation, is the Church has a real problem with science, and Right Reverend John Pritchard has been among many to point that out very generously. There must be reasons for this. Why is the Church cagey about science? It's the and. Science is either something to be completely rejected or it's something to be utterly embraced within the theology of the kingdom of God. So one thing I wanted to write about is what science would look like within a wholehearted kingdom salvation history narrative. Well, okay, one little clue. Here's a little clue. Here's a study of nanotechnology. Run out of Durham, or the European project, a couple of years ago by my colleague Phil McNaughton. And the social scientists there analysed the public debate, one of these jarred public debates I mentioned before, around nanotechnology, and pulled out the fact that underneath the surface of the ostensibly technological risk-based arguments were deeply lying narratives. Be careful for what you wish for. Opening Pandora's box, because once the troubles are out, you can't get them back in. Messing with nature, because nature is sacred. The scientists will keep us in the dark. It's a power play. And the rich get richer and the poor get poorer through all these things. Jean-Pierre Dupuy, the philosopher, identified them as the narratives of desire, evil, sacred, alienation, and exploitation. And the fact that there is not a single matching ancient narrative, if you like, that takes science forward in a positive way, plays to my concern. A couple more clues before I stop. George Steiner. There's a number of us have discussed this evening over supper his book, wonderful book, Real Presences, a post-Holocaust atheist Jew, a cultural historian and critic writing about the differences between the broken contract between the humanities and the world that the humanities speak of. And at one point says this, we all might have to read it 2 or 3 times if it's the first time you've come across this sentence, only art can go some way towards making accessible, towards waking into some measure of communicability the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. Like Hannah Arendt, like Heidegger, like others before him, he identifies the gulf between the non-human world of nature and the human world which is us, our psyches, our beings, and that there is a reconciliation to be read. And for me, this was cathartic. Reading this sentence, my initial reaction was, well, thank you, Professor Steiner, but I think I've picked up a clue to my search, my lifelong search for what science is for. No one actually teaches a scientist at school or at university anymore what our science is actually for, humanly, and it made sudden sense to me that reconciling our minds with this material world around us didn't answer the question, but it pushed us along through the door to the road of asking what a cultural narrative for science might be. And then Job. Don't, of course, look out for science in the Bible, but you might look for wisdom around the physical world, our relationship with nature. And when I've encouraged scientists at conferences after the common discussion around God and religion and science over the beer at in the bar after the conference talk, and I said, well, actually, have you ever read the Lord's answer to Job? Well, if you haven't, well, actually, of course, thanks to the Gideons, one text that I know will be by their bedside will be the Old Testament. And so Job in the Morris in the middle, open it up, don't have to read all of it, but read the Lord's answer. This extraordinary question form poetry. Have you journeyed to the springs of the deep? Where is the way to the abode of light? From whose womb comes the ice? It's achingly beautiful poetic questions around the physical world. Can't believe that the interpretation of this is just a mere petulant deity slapdown of annoying complainer. It's a far deeper text than that, but we can explore that later on. We'll whiz through that actually, and all I will say, just to give an example of the sort of things I pull out from Job, is that there are a number of perspectives in this extraordinary text in the book of Job. The encoding of a moral law in the universe, nature as internal mystery, nature as a book to read, nature as an uncontrolled chaos of storm and fire and earthquake, as Job himself well knows. Nature as an object of worship, but critically, there's an extra narrative. Nature as a way to unlock the search for wisdom, true wisdom, through perceiving and seeing nature as she really is in measure. Extraordinary claim that I think you can map these ancient wisdom literature narratives onto the surviving negative narratives that Dupuy pulled out of our troubled technology debate, apart from one, which might just be the clue to the missing narrative for science. There, what does theology give? Doesn't theology give us rich resources to perhaps solve some of these pressing social and cultural problems around science? So what would a theology of science look like? And here's my just suggestion. As a scientist, very amateur theologian, starter for 10. It would recognise this deeply long linear history of relationship with a past, a present and a future between the human and the non-human. It would celebrate a high view of human aptitude to reimagine nature, this extraordinary ability we have to build reconciliatory bridges with nature, to replace ignorance with knowledge, fear with understanding. It has a dual structure, typically Hebraic, wisdom and knowledge, science and technology. That's a question. It warns us that engaging with nature is ambiguous and painful. And one thing I've noticed in my biblical walk, through every single text in the scriptures, old and new, that refer to a human relationship with the physical world, the context is pain. Genesis, Proverbs, Job, just think them through. Or at least every text apart from one. That there's a balance of order and chaos. And that this deliciousness of fruitful chaos is another theme. That questions from Job will be central, and every scientist knows that. And finally, that science, and surprisingly, has to be marked and generated and powered by love. It's a work ultimately of love, which is a strange thing for a scientist to say, but listen to what scientists say about what they do, and you might not be so surprised. At that point, I shall, in fear and trembling, hand over to my panel. Or your panel. Thank you. And to you. And I'm instructed to do this. And this. There we go.
Well, Tom, thank you very much indeed. And what we're going to do now is invite our panelists to make a response. We're keeping this really quite informal. We're going to, in effect, invite our panelists just to say what they found interesting or what they wanted to highlight or talk about in the book. And so you'll find that each will probably pick up on quite different themes. I'm going to, in fact, give our panelists permission to say a bit more about themselves and then what they picked up from the book. And our first response is going to be from Professor Catherine Blundell, who's an astrophysicist. So Catherine, I'm going to invite you to stay where you are or come here as you please and make your response to Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Tom. Can you actually hear me at the back, or would it be easier if I stood up? You can hear me okay? Splendid, thank you.
There's a microphone.
I have a microphone, thank you. Well, I was very happy indeed to see the title of Tom's book, Faith and wisdom in science. You see, in my field, in the field of astrophysics and cosmology, the field does have a certain reputation. The famous Russian physicist Lev Landau said of cosmologists that they are often in error, but rarely in doubt. And as many of you will know, my particular field has undergone quite dramatic changes of mind about the nature of the universe in which we live in very recent decades. We've gone from the paradigm of a steady state universe to an expanding universe to an accelerating universe. And of course, the business of being a good scientist is, as of course being a good economist, is that in the light of new information, we are free to change our minds. And I hope that in being an honest seeker after the truth, that's something that's very precious and very important in the business of being a practitioner of science, as of course it is in matter of discerning truths about faith and the Bible. As it happens, my work in the last few years has led me to make a very significant number of long-haul flights, and I'm sure many of you for whom that's also true will have had the experience of speaking to a great many different folk from different cultures in the course of doing that. I'm quite fascinated with the reaction that I get when people ask me what I'm doing and why I'm flying to wherever. If at all they get a sense that I'm a scientist, to the extent that I've learnt, if I want a peaceful flight and I just want to be able to sleep for 10 hours or whatever, the very best answer to give is that I work with computers. That's guaranteed to just draw the conversation to a graceful close. But if I say that I'm a professor of astrophysics or something vaguely along those lines, a really bad reaction is a follow-up question about horoscopes, and that's always a bit of a disappointment. But of course, the very best kind of reaction is a common reaction from whatever culture, that science is fascinating, that the natural world is fascinating, that the night sky is fascinating, and that it draws people in and enriches their thinking and their appreciation of life. But of course, the sad thing is that science can be a very alienating experience for many people. It can be an area of fear because, not the least, scientists do use jargon, words loaded with meaning that are very powerful and resonant with meaning for us, but actually pretty alienating for other people. In much the same way that the church can use language which can so easily alienate and baffle. It's my view that science is for everyone, and it makes me very sad to see that there is this so often this idea that there must be a conflict between science and a conflict with faith, as Tom, of course, tackles head-on in his book. In my experience, the polarisation of that debate very often comes from people who know nothing at all of true faith or nothing at all about science, sometimes nothing at all about both those things. But I think what's very important about Tom's book is that it does mandate that we address and think about these things in an integrated way. As scientists, we are not just a brain on two legs. We're real humans with hearts and lives and real humanity as well. So to think that life is just about science is to really miss out on life itself. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Picking up there on some themes towards the beginning of the book and also actually towards the end. While Andrew's wiring up, I was just reflecting on what both Catherine and Tom were saying. I used to work at King's College London, and we had to put a sort of category against all of our publications. And had one which was on science and religion, so we had this drop-down menu. And the university had predetermined what all the categories were. And the only one I could find was science versus religion. And it just struck me that sort of way somehow objectifies the deep concern that certainly Tom has flagged up and which Catherine has mentioned again. Our next respondent is Andrew Pinsent, who needs no introduction, but I'll invite him to give one anyway and then tell us about his response to the book.
Thank you. I will stand up, and I think I'll just walk over here so that that's a bit easier to speak, particularly to the back. Is that all right? Okay, very good. Well, first of all, my name is Andrew Pinsent. My background, it was originally in particle physics. I worked at CERN looking for the Higgs boson. I spent several years studying philosophy, and I also trained as a priest during the course of the training for which I also studied a good deal of theology. I wouldn't normally mention all those facts except to explain why I found this book such fun. It's intellectual fun in a very serious way, an important way. So to give you a taste of some of the little gems in this book, we've got, for example, Gregory of Nyssa's sister on her deathbed speculating about the interaction of air and water. We've got Robert Grosseteste in the Middle Ages discussing the self-propagation of the universe from light, a sort of medieval Big Bang. We've got discussion of the physics of storms, of earthquakes, of sand piles, of twisted molecules, controversies on string theory, the non-overlapping magisteria, the role of love in science, speculations about priestly attitudes towards science, Fermat's last theorem, the disease of secondary discourse. And it's a wonderful, almost an entire encyclopedia in itself, this short book, and it left me wanting to go away and start investigating more of these topics, because to my embarrassment, some of these things were new to me, and I thank you for that. So, what's the bottom line? What's the grand message, at least perceived by this reader? Well, basically a two-line summary would be: narrative is overwhelmingly important, and choose your narrative carefully. Choose your narratives very carefully. So towards the end of the book, we're presented with 5 narratives, for example, that make discussion of certain topics almost impossible, because the narratives are so deeply embedded in people's minds, they can't be discussed very well. There's another narrative which is becoming dominant and increasingly damaging in our society, the narrative that science must be useful, that all academic work must be useful. That would have been news to Aristotle, who said that the highest good, the highest intellectual pursuits were useless. In fact, there's a little line, it's not in the book, but it made me think about this. If the Egyptian priests had not had leisure time to do useless things, they would never have invented mathematics. And that's something that Aristotle says in the first chapter of the first book of the Metaphysics. So, so this narrative which is taking control, that everything has to be useful in white papers, research assessment exercises, is deeply damaging. So that's another narrative. And the message that seems to be presented in the book is that there is this other narrative in the background, this theological narrative, which has shaped the way we perceive the world in extraordinarily fruitful ways. And if the book achieves nothing else, it would, nothing else other than encouraging people to look at the wisdom literature, look at those creation narratives in wonder and be excited by them, then the book, for this alone, has done a wonderful job. So I thank you for that. So, quick comment about what could be drawn out which isn't in the book, but might be useful to think about. I think the difference between knowledge and understanding, that would have been a nice thing to draw out a little more, because I think it's absolutely central to Professor McLeish's intent. Narrative shapes understanding, understanding shapes how we put facts together. And there's a whole philosophy of perception about this, very important. So that provides perhaps shows a causal link between those two faculties. And then in the book of Job, there are many things brought out. One other thing that might be of interest is the importance of the you form. And there is a line in the book about there's a new perspective that God is giving, which decentralizes humanity from a claim to primacy within creation. And that's true, but there's another aspect to it as well. It's not so much to make humanity small, but to bring humanity out of a closed-in state where man centralizes himself and our vision is dominated by ourselves. And it's almost as if in the book of Job, if I may say so, it's almost as if there's a party going on and we've not been invited. God is playing with creation and he almost addresses the human being. Where are you? You're not involved in as I play with these animals and and the rain and the snow. And come and join in. And Job is trembling on the verge of waking up to this bigger world, as I think he does at the end. And in Christian theology, we would call this the life of grace. And grace transforms our perception of nature. And when people say, what does theology do for science? Well, I think there's another resource we can draw looking at what's happened to art for the last few centuries. First of all, we got rid of the grace elements. About 500 years ago, we began to minimize the saints. We began to minimize the supernatural revelation. And then we started to draw wonderful pictures of nature. But in the last century and a half, the nature has begun to break up. And it's almost as if the loss of the grand narrative means even the world appears fragmented to us now. And I think in the long term, that will be damaging for science as well. And I love science as well as matters of faith. So I thank you, Professor McLeish, for this wonderful book, which is serious fun. And I'm going to go away and read some of these many little the cameos that you put in that have whetted my curiosity. Thank you.
And thank you, Andrew, for a very interesting and engaging response. Now, tonight we have a cornucopia of Professor Blundell's. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the second of these. This is Professor Stephen Blundell, who I'll ask if you would just say something about your own work and then...
Thank you. I'll maybe stand over here and follow Andrew's example. Thank you. Well, I'm married to Catherine, but I'm also a professor of condensed matter physics. So I work in an experimental area here in Oxford, which is not a million miles away from the kind of thing that Tom does. I was struck reading this book. I think we were talking a little bit about this earlier this evening. If you live in a mechanistic society, in other words, something a little bit like existed in the former communist regimes, where essentially you are a cog in a wheel. You're brought up to do a single task, a single career, and you follow a set of rules, and you never go outside that little cell, that little boundary in which society has placed you. Then in that kind of society, you just follow rules. You're an automaton, and you have no need for stories. But if you live in a more complex society, more unpredictable society, the kind of society we live in, then you've got more complicated architectures to navigate in life. And that's where stories help. Because I think the purpose of narrative is it helps you navigate complexity, because you can't use a set of rules. And stories help because they give you those instincts to respond in particular ways to uncertainty. And so I think a very key part of this book is actually the role of narrative, and Tom stresses this a lot. It comes out in a way, I think, from Tom's own story, his own narrative. Tom is as he explained earlier, he's a theoretical condensed matter physicist who has spent a lot of his working life doing theoretical physics. He now finds himself in the role of Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and talking, as he said earlier, to all these different groups of people. And he is fascinated, rather than just moving into being an administrator, he engages. And he finds these different areas, not just it's not just a drudge to talk to them, but it's stimulating. It's clearly informed his perspective. And I think that's actually a rather wonderful thing. He's done interdisciplinary research, linking together physicists and medieval scholars looking at the work of Robert Grosseteste, and some of that scholarship comes out in his book. Now, I'm sure he's going to get into trouble with this, because some people are going to say, particularly if he's stumbled into their particular specialist area, what on earth is a theoretical physicist doing in biblical commentary and linking all of these different areas? He's stumbled into my specialist area and without the decades of experience that you need to properly understand this. But I think actually in doing that, he's embodying his very thesis, which is that it's all about breaking down barriers. And it's all about this holistic way of saying that, no, the study of everything is part of what it's all about. That's what theology should do, and that's what science should do. And that's a path that's fraught with danger, but it's the right thing to do. And I think it's a brave, exhilarating, exciting, and I think, as has already been said, a fun way of going through this wonderful world we find ourselves. I think it is actually the path of wisdom. And one strong theme that comes out of the book is this great redemptive quality that bringing these different areas together has. And so it's very much a story of redemption, as theology is the story of redemption. That's what he's trying to do with developing a theology of science that I think has got a lot of new ideas in it. I particularly liked one of his comments about the scientific priesthood, which is a phrase that is often used pejoratively. So these terrible scientists who've set themselves up as the arbiters of life and death, they've become a kind of scientific priesthood, elevated above everyone else. Well, I think as he points out, this misunderstands the nature of priesthood in the New Testament, where the priest is the agent of the redemptive power of God. And in that kind of way, what one is trying to do as a scientist is actually be part of that re-engagement with curious questions, which is a key part of human redemption. And I think that's a key theme that comes out from the book. I think it's also very encouraging to see a practicing scientist write about the areas of science and faith. I think it's good that somebody who is embedded in the practice of doing science today is doing this, because one of the other issues that comes out very strongly towards the end of the book is the fact that actually a lot of being a scientist is not this wonderful engagement with ideas. That's what you want it to be, but actually it's the grubby business of grants and funding, of apportioning credit in papers, in being in a UK university with all of its politics, and actually engaging in that whole morass of complexity and sometimes ugliness is actually part of what it is to be human in a real situation, and that's a very key point to think through. And I'm really glad he brought up those kinds of issues. And also he mentions a lot, you get this of course from the book of Job, about the theme of pain and failure. And again, a lot of our writing in the philosophy of science or the history of science is the story of heroes. These wonderful people who battle against the existing establishment, the scientific establishment. They have their wonderful idea, they have their eureka moment, and the world is changed. But in fact, there are lots of wonderful stories about scientists who've done this, who've then come up against failure. We all think about Einstein in 1905, but we think of him less in the 19s and 20s and 30s, beating his head against a brick wall, trying to find a unified theory. Plenty of other great scientists who had wonderful moments that we all remember in the history books did other things where they were coming up against failure. And that's a key part of what it means to be a scientist, and engaging in that, I think, is a really important thing. A narrative of science which is not just the story of heroes and heroines, that it's also a story of engaging with failure and what you do with that. So I think actually one of the key parts of this book is actually the engagement with those kind of meta issues that lie outside the traditional narrative of science. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. We mentioned earlier that Tom McLeish comes from Durham, and in fact our next panelist also has links with Durham. The Bishop of Oxford here basically was previously warden of Cranmer Hall in Durham for about 8 years, and then returned there as Bishop of Jarrow, that suffered into Durham for 5 years before becoming Bishop of Oxford. So I'd very much invite you to welcome John Pritchard, Bishop of Oxford, who's now going to make his response to this very interesting book. I think we might just shut the door, because it's 8 week and people are clearly very excited about the idea of the academic year ending, and we can do without hearing that.
Well, if it's a television with it, I'm also very much aware we're competing with a certain event. Yes.
John?
If anyone cares to find out the score and just bring it in, would you? I'd be really pleased to know. Could you? Thank you. Being here at this time has meant a considerable sacrifice, you understand. Thank you very much, Alistair and Tom. I'm going to remain seated because I think it befits my modest contribution to what we're talking about, because I'm the joker in the pack. I'm not a scientist, but I am fascinated by the area that we're discussing tonight, and so have read a lot, but only as a hopefully intelligent layperson, not with the knowledge that there is in this room. Actually, let me Catherine just mentioned, my equivalent to what you do is when I'm travelling by train or something like that, and I want a quiet time, I just wear this and I smile at people and I say, do come and sit alongside me. I have it all to myself then. It's wonderful. Anyway, I think I'm engaging with this from three different angles, really, or why I'm here, I suppose. The first is that I recognise, as we all do, that these grand narratives that are shaping our culture are ones which, as a jobbing bishop, which is what I am, I need to deal with, to understand, to try to not answer, but to try to engage with in a creative way. So what are the big influences in our culture? Science is clearly the big kind of unspoken narrative that lies behind all the young people's approach to their cultural engagement. So that there's a kind of scientific mindset. I therefore want to understand as much as I can. And the field of apologetics is therefore has been just a constant one. I mean, Alice has written much better than I ever have on that. But the whole apologetic field is crucial to me as a bishop who has to be called upon to speak in public about all kinds of things. But underlying it are worldviews. And I'm always asking, what are the worldviews and what are shaping these worldviews? Because the kind of science that, sadly, I'd have to say probably the fourth former has not been very well taught, is dealing with. That's what I want somehow to unravel that. So anyway, that's my apologetic route is one way in. My second route in is, I suppose I do get fed up really with superficial atheism, and I just want something much more sophisticated in the debate. And coming to Oxford, obviously there's a whole cauldron of faith and no faith and philosophical atheism and scientific atheism and so on. But some of it, at least at the not within Oxford, but the way it's then projected out from here and across our culture, is pretty puerile, really. And it's that straw man of theology or religion that is put up so often that I just want to bypass and get into more serious debate, which is why, Tom, I'm really pleased to hear the way you identify that word "and" as a crucial one. And we live in a culture which is forever putting one against another. So the adversarial conflict is the stuff of the media. And I want to get beyond that and say, so what is it when you really engage with intelligence, sophistication, and genuine listening? So it's a kind of more adult dialogue that I'm after as well. The third way in, I suppose, I'm coming is that I have a responsibility in the Church of England for education. Actually, I say that rather grandly, but there was something in the somebody telegraphed just before Christmas. It was an article about something I'd said, and it said, the Right Reverend John Pritchard, Bishop of Oxford, who's responsible for the education of 1 million children. No wonder I feel tired, I thought. But the truth is that the Church of England has got 1 million children in its schools every day. That a quarter of the primary schools in the country are Church of England schools, and hundreds of secondary schools as well. So my concern is what is shaping the lives of these young people who are today's citizens and tomorrow's shapers of the world. And if it's based on a narrow reductionist rationalism that hasn't allowed for the holism that I trust we would talk about, then we are selling our youngsters short. So I'm always concerned about how we are, why and how, and in what style we are educating our youngsters. I mean, I have a particular responsibility for church schools, but obviously I'm concerned about all schools. So that still doesn't really explain why I'm here. I think I'm only here because in a sabbatical last year, seeing that there was some Templeton money that was supporting some very interesting projects going on up in Durham, and taking any excuse to get back to Durham, I shot up for a short conference, and there, lo and behold, amongst half a dozen really fascinating professors of science of one form or another, was Tom. And I just loved the way that Tom spoke with freshness and imagination and enthusiasm, and it was just great. So I wanted to keep in touch, and then I heard this book was coming out and was delighted. But what is it? It was Emily Dickinson who said, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." And I love that kind of approach to, I suppose, to apologetics, to, to doctrine, to, all sorts of things. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. The arts, literature, all sorts of things do that. And I see that here in this book. This is telling all the truth, but telling it slant. It's coming in from different angles. And, anyone who has chapters like, the case of the surprising jelly, has got my vote. And here is Tom writing some very imaginative material, and I'm delighted to be here and to taking very little part in the subsequent discussion because I won't understand it.
That's not true. If that's true, I've completely failed. Thank you, John.
John, thank you very much indeed. In a moment, I'm going to ask Tom if he'd like to respond to the panelists. I'll just make a few comments of my own, if I may. I think there are three things that stood out for me that weren't necessarily picked up by others. One was how much I appreciate the emphasis on the diversity of doctrines of creation in the Old Testament and the innate tendency to prioritize one particular reading of the book of Genesis. And I think that has bedeviled us, if I can put it like that, for many years. And it's good just to hear that laid out. I think my second 2 points really are just saying it's very interesting to take this book and read it alongside two other books. One of them is a very interesting book by Charles Taylor called A Secular Age. And the one thing that really stood out in that book for me, which I hear echoed very clearly in what's been said by Tom and the panel, is that Taylor in effect makes the point that what he calls an immanent frame, that is to say a sort of reductionist way of thinking, has become so deeply embedded as a cultural narrative that those who dispute it are almost labelled irrational right from the word go. And this is not about the rationality of a question or a narrative. It's about the sociological dominance of a narrative which does not allow rivals in the public sphere. And so I think one of the questions that does arise from Tom's book is the cultural question of how you counter the cultural hegemony of one particular narrative, which is clearly faulty. I think that's a very interesting point. The second book I'd like to set this alongside is actually by Paul Fiddis, who's here, and that is his Bampton Lectures, which also engage the theme of wisdom and also actually makes extensive use of the book of Job. And one question which Professor Fiddis raises, which I think is a very good question, is isn't actually wisdom rather a complex idea? And we tend to think of it as being a jolly good thing. Professor Fiddis, in effect, just raises the whole question of perhaps a slightly darker side of this. And I haven't time to go into that in detail, but I think one of the points that I hear emerging from this book is this question, look, who are these scientists? That they're human beings like the rest of us, and they may make some very bad judgments, and an awful lot may rest on that. And this whole question of how can wisdom, in effect, do something good for people who are very deeply entrenched in certain ways of thinking, which might actually predispose them to act in ways that are not wise. In other words, can we heal ourselves by becoming wise, or is actually wisdom something that requires a kind of transformation on our part? So many very interesting questions raised by this book. The panel, I think, has clearly found an awful lot to talk about, but we must give, I think, Tom a chance just to respond to what's been said. And then for the rest of the evening, we're in your hands as you raise any questions you like. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Tom.
Oh, gosh. Thank you, Alice, very much. Well, they've had such generous and interesting comments, but I should come to the most important question first, to which the answer is we're 3 minutes into the second half. Suarez put the only goal in the back of the net at 39 minutes, so it's 1-0. Sorry for those of you. Oh, spoiler. Oh, dear. I did say I would, though. So there we are. Now to more minor things. Yeah, my mind's reading. Actually, at each of these wonderful events, I realise that there's 10 more chapters I want to have written. So I might. What I am thinking of doing, in fact, is actually launching a blog, Faith and Wisdom Science, and actually taking questions and developing them a little further, and just see how that goes. That's a rather meta statement. People are nodding their heads. If you think that's a good idea, then let's do that, and we can all write about this stuff. I think we've hit I feel, just like the oil, miners prospectors of old, I do feel that we, and I do say we, I mean, I've articulated this, but I feel for many ways there's many voices in this book, and the huge number of people who've helped me interact with me when I've written it. I had the impression that it was many people said, so actually Daniel Reed, who's written the only review on Amazon at the moment, said, his first sentence was, I feel this book needed to be written for a long time. And that was a very generous thing, but it actually describes my experience. I felt that the book was writing itself rather than me having to do with it. And I think these comments are reinforcing that actually there are many voices here, and that it's time for us to say something about our teleological narratives. It's time to say that the claim that there are no meta-narratives is the biggest false meta-narrative of all of them, and to start being honest about this. And I loved Catherine's underlining that science can be and should be something for everyone. If you've read as far as the 2 pages of the introduction of the book, you'll know there's quite a lot of music in here as well. And actually, Jeremy Begbie and others have been a pattern for me. Yes, music is an enormously important part of my family's life, but it's also true that I've been inspired by those people who've been trying to think purposefully about a theology of music, that goes beyond a study of sacred music, but it asks culturally, theologically, what is music for? What does it achieve for us? And one thing that music has achieved, of course, is a universal engagement, providing, by the way, local authorities and do not cut out to the current government ideas and pull funding from music, by the way. But that's not something that we do for science. But Catherine also warned us that we slip into alienating language and jargon. And how terrible it is when the very words that we want to use to heal and enliven become the words that alienate and deaden. So thank you very much for that. Let me just pick one thing, Andrew. Knowledge and understanding. Yes, this dualism, I just hinted at it. And the complexity of the dualism, I hope, and I know we're going to hear from Professor Paul Fides in just a little while, who very kindly sent me this, the book that Alistair referred to at the end, around which I have a horrific sort of frozen relationship. I'm in a way glad I didn't know about Paul's book before I wrote mine, because I think if I had, I would have not tried, because you've also, Paul, put chaos and wisdom together in the way I thought I might have been doing for the first time. No, there's nothing new under the sun. But I'm glad, but I'm so much enjoying it now. So that the depth and subtlety of wisdom, and what Job is doing, Andrew called the you form, the taking our very self-centeredness, removing our self-centeredness without putting us into Douglas Adams' total perspective vortex, if you like. That's the balance. And what Job and the wisdom literature achieve quite extraordinarily is to decentralize the human, but at the same time celebrate the human in being a co-creator and co-worker, and step up, Job, and step up, disciples, and step up, says Jesus, and you are my brothers and my sisters. It's just extraordinary how those two things work together. And that's one of the most wonderful things about Christianity, of course, that those of us who know about it just continue to revisit and relive over and over again. But I recognise that that's not been fully thought through, but in the spirit of Job, my answer to Andrew is the book asks more questions, of course, than it answers them, and that's largely the point. But that sounds like a cop-out. More work to do. Stephen, thank you. Negotiating failure. I could have written much more about that. In fact, I tweeted yesterday about an extraordinary, honest post. Young scientist who posted an anti-CV. Brave a postdoc who, and I'll find you the website, who's posted the CV of all the grants he'd failed, all the jobs he hadn't gotten applied for, all the scientific results he'd hoped to achieve but had failed to. And it's extraordinary, honest reading. It's breathtakingly wonderful reading, and it almost belongs in the wisdom literature canon. So thank you, and for also drawing attention to the priesthood. Now we didn't have time to discuss that, but again, it was in. Let me just say, one of the many occasions on which I've drawn the wisdom of colleagues throughout this thing was a weekend that years ago I was asked I was asked to speak for 1 hour on science and religion to the Ripon Deanery. This is some of the mid-90s. The day before the weekend at which I was trying to ask, well, would you like me to come on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday? I got, oh no, we want you to be there the whole time. You're running the weekend. There was some slight communication, but it transpired how I did that was I got everyone to do a lot of work for me. And one of the more Anglo-Catholic young priests there pushed me on the high view of priesthood. And we have this, as of those of us who come from perhaps a more evangelical background, we're not very biblical when it comes to priesthood. We read the theology of the universal priesthood as being a theology of no priesthood, and that won't do. That won't do. So this idea of priests being negotiating the restorative contract, or the restorative covenant rather, between a people and a creator. I was challenged with that. I realised that what, of course, a universal priesthood means is that that's all our daily theology. We are all somewhere where we are priests in that sense. So the reconciliatory theology, I think, dovetails in with a priesthood. I've actually used this idea pastorally a couple of times in Durham recently, and so I know it has purchase. So many thanks. John, yes. Oh, Emily Dickinson. Tell it with the truth, but tell it with a slant. I need to read more Emily. I need to read some Emily Dickinson. I know I do. Of course, one's reading is always so dry. But that's one. But of course, I do write a part of the consequences chapter here. And anyone here, I hope everyone will write a book on some of the consequences of this. There are massive educational consequences, and I know from the school our children are at, and many others, is that the very disciplinary and the ideological barriers to thought, which are not communicated but assumed, but the assumption is somehow subliminally communicated, is not a healthy situation educationally at all. And those two books. So those are just. I want to say one more thing, which is about from John's. You were fed up said you were fed up with superficial atheism. You didn't quite say, but I assume that you wouldn't be fed up with a really deep, full-blown, honest-to-God atheism. I mean, a real atheism. You see, real atheists are very, very rare, and I'm not sure there's one in Oxford, actually. They're that rare. But I have to say, as Steiner, going back to Steiner talks about atheism, and he says, for those who have really stared into the abyss, really honestly looked into it, and lived, hats off, he says. And I'd say I have a huge respect when I come across real atheists. And I wondered what to do there. Is that what you...
That's where Nietzsche comes in, isn't it, as well? I mean, there is proper atheism and its consequences. But actually this kind of pallid atheism that we've got doesn't engage.
Right. So a chapter I nearly wrote, but I just didn't have the confidence to do so, is the chapter on the theology of atheism, which, where my starting point would be Ecclesiastes. But I think that would be interesting. But I think perhaps one of you folks should do it. So enough. But thank you very, very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're in your hands. We'll take questions from the audience. Can I just get an idea of how many questions there are going to be? Because I want to make sure we try and get around as many as we can. Quite a few. So we'll start over here. I'll work back. Yes.
Where do you want to stop?
I have a very simple question and a sort of a comment at the same time. When my son started secondary school, I knew it to be an arts school and I was slightly concerned. So after about a year, I said to him, "What do you think of science?" And he said to me, "I think the art of science can be very useful." So it's really a comment on the narrative, the story, the context being so important. I think England has scored a goal.
Yeah, I'll just look at that. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yes, art of science and narrative. Yes. Should we take a few more? Should we take a few questions and then together? Yes. Sorry.
Thank you. This is not quite so much a question as a request that you singly or jointly sort of say a bit more about an issue. So the issue is surrounding this whole business of assumptions, paradigms that are assumed without consciously being thought through. I'll throw out two examples. One is the use of the word secular, because as someone who feels that that's a helpful word, or should be a helpful word, I want our politics to be one in which politicians mostly don't mention God, but that they nevertheless do what they honestly think is the best possible thing for the world we're in, and so on. That, for many of them, that means something very theological. But nevertheless, that's the sense in which secular is a good thing. And yet, of course, the word is being hijacked, I think, now. And the other word, of course, is the word religion. That's much more difficult, perhaps, to respond to. But I think I want you to agree with me whether or not you think we should try to rescue these words. Or is that just such a huge task?
Let's invite Tom to answer that, and then maybe someone else would like to as well.
The word religion, I mean rescue, because for many people the word is commonly used to mean a negative thing which can only be thought of in negative ways. And as soon as someone's action could possibly be motivated by a number of different things, such as politics, cultural background, all sorts of things, but insofar as it's a bad action, it's the religious label will be attached to it. And this goes on so frequently. That's such a big deal. I'm not sure it's unfair to ask.
Yes. Well, I might connect that with the first question or comment on the art of science, because your son, I mean, is interested, used like Emily Dickinson. I mean, rather than tackling the redefinition of words head on, by allowing two different words to collide in interesting ways, he helped you rethink what the boxes that art and science were in. So perhaps we should let 7-year-olds answer this question. So I mean, a head-on tackle at, if you'll excuse the phrase, it was won't tell me who scored. Head-on isn't going to change word use, but a contextual, surprising ambush of words, recruitment of words in new ways and in different contexts, I think might be. Now, I've never liked the word religion because of all the baggage and because I've found it an unhelpful flag because of all the negative connotations. But of course, it's only, to my shame, only writing the book, have I been forced to look at its etymology. And religios, the joining together again that word speaks of, is of course much of the speaks to the sort of reconciliation I was after. So I'm also against myself.
Yeah, the question is it? Yeah, it is. But is it recoverable? Is the question. And of course now in our there's so much unhealthy religion around. Globally, as well as so much healthy religion, but the unhealthy gets all the publicity at the moment. As a word, it is really difficult to use. It's like this another area I find difficult in education is when when Church of England schools are talked about as faith schools. They're not faith schools; they're faith-based schools, but they are actually open to the community. So words take on their meaning. What do we use instead? Popularly, of course, people have gone to spirituality rather than religion, haven't they? But actually that's saying something different. That's something about the practice of, a whole lot of religious practices. I'd like to recover the word theology, really. Of course, it has become also devalued, so people used to talk in the 60s about that's just theology, they would say, as if that's dismissed it. But I think it's because religion has got so tarnished. I think I want to recover theology.
Next question, please.
I'd like to sketch a scenario based on that evocative quotation that you put up about matter being kind of coldly inhuman. I am assuming by that we implied that it's sort of purposeless, and say not having a pattern of its own. I'm thinking very roughly in terms of it being a kind of an instantiation of forms, and that just the thing that forms are instantiated in, and therefore is somehow passive. And implicitly there would be a kind of a categorical distinction between that and sort of human, very purposeful ways of being, and that makes it easy for scientific discourse to just be a matter of, say, making hypotheses and then seeing if you can predict something, and just this sort of cold scientific process. And so based on these assumptions about, based on the, I suppose, the definition of matter, it becomes very easy to say that, well, there just isn't this kind of grand narrative in scientific practice. And if you want to assert that there is, it's just going to sort of float on top of the practice, and therefore you could float sort of all manner of narratives on top of it, and they would all work perfectly well, and they wouldn't be kind of emerging organically from the practice. And so I want to know whether you have something that isn't just floating on top of it, so to speak. And I want to know if you can do something different with even your notion of matter, which could allow something to emerge organically.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And just pulling on, what does he mean by the inhuman otherness of matter? Does it mean its lack of teleology, its purposelessness, its instantiation of form? But of course, you could also ask the question: what's he saying about humanity? What's he saying about humanness? Why is humanness? You can ask the question the other way around, and ask, well, what is it to be human then, if not to be an emergent from a collection of purposeless matter? In fact, that narrative has been told as well. I don't think that this narrative, your lovely picture of float, one could just paint off, superficially, float all sorts of narratives above the substrate of science or the world or the natural world. The interesting answer that a theology or philosophy embedded in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament as its starting point, and then taken through, gives to what you've just beautifully outlined, is a starting point that says that no, wisdom is embedded. Wisdom is embedded three-dimensionally or four-dimensionally into the fabric of matter. Whatever this thing called wisdom, which I think is actually, perhaps along with theology, maybe one of the words we want to rescue, and perhaps why it's found its way onto the front cover here. The other, I've talked about the Lord's answer to Job. The other extraordinary and important chapter in Job is the rather special chapter 28, which also looks like an interpolation, often sometimes called a hymn to wisdom, but it's absolutely core to the run of the book. That turns out to be about the search for wisdom, but it doesn't announce that at the beginning. It does the Emily Dickinson. It comes across it slantwise. It starts talking about miners. I don't mean children. I mean people with lamps on their hats that swing under the ground, and underneath the earth, the miner, the foreign miner, dangles and sways, looking up at the jewels, the gems, the metallic fissures in the rock. Only the eyes of the human under the ground sees the earth as if transformed by fire from beneath. Not even the eagle, sharp though he is in sight, sees the earth in this way. And it's an extraordinary icon of what it means to be human in our relation to nature. We perceive, I can begin to perceive through our artifice, the inner structure of nature. And that is wisdom. And although someone mentioned this dark side of wisdom before, Alistair, I think you did. The dark side of wisdom. The deeps don't know where wisdom is. The deep bottom of the sea doesn't know where wisdom is. But God does, because, and then the chapter finishes with an extraordinary redefinition of the perception of sight, because he perceives all of creation in weight and measure. I paraphrase. So there's a rootedness into space-time of this type of wisdom, which I would claim prejudices me no more away from this check of superficiality. Perhaps one more. I'd love to hear my colleagues respond to this one. But the other twist of this one is the continuity that this type of thinking gives between the human and the material. We are material. We are nature thinking about itself, after all. And from that very secular, apparently, point of view, I think can emerge, we get bizarrely to the same theological point of embeddedness, not superficiality.
Any other panellists like to come in here? They're all being very modest. John, back there. And then we'll move across to Paul.
I'm afraid I've not yet read your book, but I will certainly read it. So what I say may not be relevant to our discussion. I think there is a narrative in science, and that is evolution. But the cosmology of that narrative seems to be based upon physicalism. It's almost as if the physicalism of the pre-Socratics has re-emerged for 4 centuries in the West, and we're kind of stuck in this. And until of course you wish to humanize science, but until science is locked in this narrow physicalism, I do not see how can it be humanized.
Interesting that we've managed it nearly an hour and a half together, and haven't mentioned evolution until now. But we really did ought to. So I'm very grateful that you did. I don't have anything to say about that. So
While you think, I'll invite our very distinguished guest to respond.
Could you say what you understand by physicalism? Either you should say, or we should hear.
I can't.
But the point is, no one else can either. No. So it's a kind of cop-out term a little bit. It's so a phrase you'll sometimes hear certain philosophers use. It's the world of reality is whatever the physicists tell us it is, and that's a kind of cop-out term. So because the older term materialism is it's been awkward in particularly like modern physics, which contains all kinds of stuff which is kind of a bit weird. It's not stuff bumping into other stuff. So physicalism is a sort of expanded, but a slightly cop-out term.
Fields are not material. Space is not material. So to say that the world is physical, it misses two other concepts which are not material.
Well, fields definitely are material insofar as anything is.
So that's why the term is used, physicalism. It's whatever the physicists tell us it is. If physicists are happy talking about fields, we're happy. That's basically the action.
And they clearly are.
Well, panel's still thinking about this one, so let's move on to Paul while we continue to reflect on this.
Perhaps I could begin by saying how much I deeply appreciated reading your book. And as you indicated, we've both perceived, I think, in what we've written, this overlap between the inexhaustible mystery of nature that wisdom talks about and the complexity that modern science reveals. So it's in the light of that, really, I just wanted to question a phrase on one of your slides. It's about nature enshrining a law of moral retribution. Isn't this one of the categories that precisely the questions of God is designed to overturn? That things could be boxed up as neatly as that. So why was that phrase there, that nature enshrines a law of moral retribution?
That was the slide when I was summarising the alternative views of nature, which I think are encoded in Job, in the book of Job. So Job, in fact, the starting point of Job's three friends, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar, and to some extent their mysterious friend, is that, and the reason they have a problem with Job, is that their theology, if you like, is that nature does indeed encode meaning, but encodes this brittle meaning that if you're a good boy and girl, that the physical natural world around you will bless you, and if you are bad, then it won't, and you will suffer. Now, the wonderful work that Job does is to drive a very powerful and wonderful coaching horses of love through that brittle argument. So it's an argument which doesn't hold water. It doesn't hold water to the book of Job, and the Lord, when in his answer, because you know far better than I, declares Job to have been in the right and his friends to have been in the wrong. But of course, wisdom is much more complicated than that, and there are all these other views are adduced in the book, other ways of looking at nature. At first, I thought that this is a fragile, childish, not even Sunday school view of the cosmos, but actually, when looking at the social science, the qualitative social science analysis of some of these public technology debates that I referred to very, very briefly, you find that there is a deep-lying, rather infantile, but rather powerful narrative that propels some of the public discussion of technology, which is not all that different to that of Job's friends, in that if we do something wrong, nature knows about it and will kick us. And it's rather extraordinary to see that still alive. And of course, the wonderful thing about the whole book of Job is that the cosmology and the chaoticness of nature it parallels the legal argument. I mean, the reason that Job brings all this cosmology and nature poetry out is because his argument to God is, you are, O Creator, just as out of control of the natural world as you are of the moral world. I know I am righteous, and I have not deserved the suffering which has fallen upon me. But what more can I expect from a deity who seems unable to control the storm, the fire, the earthquake, the flooded wadi, the destroyed crops? And so there's this parallel wisdom of morality and understanding and physical understanding, which is then released in this wonderful decentralizing but elevating narrative of into complexity.
So are you happy where Job leaves us?
Oh, and no, I didn't think it was supposed to be.
Okay.
But
so
it's
how do you read the end? Yeah. What do you want?
Well, I'm kind of. I don't. The end is a bit saccharine for me, actually.
Yeah.
To be honest. Then if you know, those of you read Job. But of course, like one of those Shakespeare plays, which is the one that begins with the that doesn't close properly. That begins with the setting up of the mast. The Shakespeare play, which is a play within a play, but at the end of the play, you never come out of the play. Do you know what I mean? Job is like that. So Job sets up a sort of theatre within a theatre in his prologue, and you never come out at the end. So, Andrew, you're the expert.
Oh no, just add something here. They may be familiar with this, but there's the patristic interpretation of the book of Job. So Job loses his natural virtues at the beginning of the book.
Yes.
The four corners of the house collapse. The four cardinal virtues collapse. So Job is trying to be a moral person in the normal sense. and all that collapses. But by the end, his life is transformed, and there's a special mention made of his 3 daughters, who are described as the most beautiful women in the world. And the patristics looked at this and said, number 3, female, this is faith, hope and charity. So Job has a new set of virtues, and they're transformed because they're, if you like, their second personal in relationship to God. So the sacrifice, the suffering, has acted as a kind of a catalyst to bring him into a kind of awakened relationship to God with his new virtues. That's a patristic statement.
Yes, I mean, whether we think about that, I think that's a kind of. But actually, what it does. Well, the one thing about Job is its honesty about pain. And like I said before, what's extraordinary, realistic about biblical literature all the way through is its honesty about pain, suffering, loose ends, questions that don't get answered. It's not. That's very just honest. And see, there is only one place, as I mentioned before, where any structural description of nature is described without the context of pain, and that's Revelation 21, when it's explicit. It's the way we're talking about the new heavens, the new earth. And this brings back to Steiner, because one of the wonderful things about Steiner's real presence is, and why it sort of infects this book, is that Steiner, as a post-Holocaust atheist, he's a real atheist, of course, Jewish real atheist, of course, but even Steiner uses the Easter picture, the Easter narrative, to describe our experience. He says we all know the Friday of suffering and loss. All of us know that. We all know the hope of the Sunday of the resurrection. We're all driven by some power of hope, but we all live in the Saturday. And I've loved that Trinitarian and Easter powerful vehicle, which for Steiner is clearly a vehicle of cultural healing. And so in a way this is a very Saturdays-ish book, and I think that's
thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sure you all want to read this book. Perhaps also you might want to try reading the book of Job again in the light of this evening conversation. Some notices. We will be resuming these lecture series next term after the long vacation, and the first such meeting will be on Thursday of second week. That's the 23rd of October. The speaker will be myself, and I haven't yet decided what I'll be talking about. It will quite possibly be on the theme of science and religion. 3 days earlier that week, that's on Monday the 20th of October, I'll be giving an inaugural lecture in the examination schools here in Oxford at 5 o'clock. You're all most welcome to that. And that will be about the place of science and religion in the academy and also in a broader culture. We'd like to, I think, say some thanks. We want to thank the John Templeton Foundation, who very kindly underwritten the costs of these seminars over the last 5 years. And so that clearly is quite significant. We'd also like to thank our speaker tonight, who I think has given us a splendid feast to reflect on. And also, I think, our panellists, who have, I think, added their own tonalities and voices and actually moved the discussion on still further. And of course, we'd like to thank you for coming, and we very much hope we'll see you again next year. Thank you very much indeed.